A few months ago, I bought Mothership. Mothership is a tabletop role-playing game where you play as indebted space scavengers, not too unlike the movie Alien. Similarly, you'll go to a place, scavenge something, and it'll be full of spooky monsters and creepy creatures. Sure, the horror of being chased down from a strange monster, but also the horror of working in a completely unregulated capitalist hellscape, where some people need to scavenge dangerous dead ships to afford a life, while some people barely lift a finger and control a majority of the galaxy's economy.
I love my escape is fiction.
You and your friends may be able to beat this one big bug monster, but you're never going to beat the fact that you're dealing with the big bug because your employer is wringing you dry. I should also probably mention that the game seems quite fun. You see, I haven't played it, but it's always been recommended to me as a good time. The game does have some unique and interesting mechanics. I really like this part of the dying system where you don't know what you rolled on the death save until someone manages to find it and check your body. Sure, that means if no one checks your body, you just end up dead, but it's neat how that information is kept from the player for some time. I also really like how the game is formatted and how many interesting little gems there are for GMs and players to discover throughout the book. Additionally, the deluxe box for Mothership is my second favorite physical RPG product ever. Overall, the game is a fun experience with some neat bonuses in there for people who really want to dive into it. There. A short, completely unplayed review of Mothership. The whole reason I bring it up is to discuss the fact that Mothership has no stealth roll. It's a game about running away from horror monsters. Being able to hide from them is probably very important for the long-term health of your character. Yet, the author of the game, Sean McCoy, thought it was an unnecessary addition to the game's rules. Here's a full quote. "If I included a stealth mechanic, what would happen is the player would say, 'I want to hide,' and I would say, 'make a hide check.' But the very interesting thing about role-playing games is the call and response between the referee and the players. Stealth is so core to Mothership that I wanted to put all the imagination on that part of the game, with no system to adjudicate it. I want to say, you hear the creature, it is crawling across the bulkhead, what do you want to do? And you say, I want to hide. I say where, you say, what's around me? There's a locker, a gurney, some curtains. Okay, I want to hide in the locker. You can hide in the locker, but it's too narrow to have your weapon with you, etc. Giving you nothing was better than giving you something that was going to make you skip over the most tense part of the game." McCoy's quote is interesting here because it seems to describe how having a mechanic for something means we are omitting ways to describe or play with those ideas in the fiction of the world that we collectively build. In other words, he's making the argument that rules elide. They, by their nature, omit a discussion which could have been worked out in an unstructured role-playing scene. This is a concept that is shared by many members of the OSR and rules-like community. If you want to make your game about something, you shouldn't have rules regarding that activity, since it removes the conversation and takes the player out of the shared world you've been working to build with them. While this idea may seem attractive initially, I find myself disagreeing with a lot of it. Rules serve a function other than omitting parts of the game people don't want to roleplay. In some circumstances, the rules allow for more interesting stories. To get to why, though, we need to ask some even more fundamental questions. Before we discuss rules in TTRPGs, I want to talk about why other games have rules, as that may help guide us as we are discussing why TTRPGs may or may not have similar kinds of rules. First, I want to talk about competitive games. Restrictions on competitive games make sense for a few reasons, although I'm mostly going to focus on just one: fairness. In competitive environments, there's a lot of room for random chance to play a factor in victory. This is why something like an athlete's record is more important than any specific match they play in. You want to see strong, consistent performance over a long period of time. There's too much that could go wrong with a specific game or a specific moment to make a judgment call about the player. If you play a fighting game, there are also rules about how long matches should be, which stages you're allowed to play on, and what options you're allowed to pick. These are ways to limit variables other than the competitor's skills. This is important for building an environment where it feels as though the competitors are consistently improving, and they're not simply winning due to dumb luck. Competitive games want to be won clearly and consistently, which rules help by standardizing a lot of the discussion around the game. Everyone knows how big a football field is, everyone knows how far from the basket you have to be to get 3 points, and everyone knows exactly how a pawn is supposed to move and oh, would you look at that? Rules provide a consistent baseline for discussion in competitive games to ensure everyone is meeting the standards set out by them. This is the way young people learn they can be talented at these games, since people know exactly how to recreate the environment these games offer. With the discussion standardized, there's little question about how something should or shouldn't work if you're trying to do it yourself at home. In other words, it's clear when you cheat, which is also helped by having clear and concise rules. Players, referees, and bystanders can hold other competitors to a consistent standard, which helps with its goal of making sure the games test the skill prowess of its players rather than inconsistent circumstances. All this is important for competitive games to function well. Another type of game I wanted to talk about before we move on to TTRPGs are single-player video games. Competitive games want to breed fairness, but in a single-player video game, there are no other players to be fair to. So we have to ask why rules exist in these games. The most obvious reason to me is to limit options and create challenges. If you're playing Devil May Cry 5, there's a reason certain options can only be done in the air a certain number of times. If you could do them all the time in the air, it would get rid of a lot of the emphasis of gaining that air time through clever use of your surroundings and skillful play. In The Legend of Zelda, you can't just increase your health to maximum from the start, since it would make the game too easy and would ruin your reason to go out and explore the world around you. These rules work to restrict the player's options and make them consider challenges differently or at all. They are important to keep in for that reason. Rules also exist to make sure the player understands the game world and how to interact with it. If you were to play Mega Man X and you defeat a boss and not gain any additional powers, you'd probably be pretty frustrated. If all the other 7 bosses gave you a power, but one of them just didn't, you'd be upset at the game providing you an expectation it wasn't going to fulfill. The rule of Mega Man X is that after each of the Maverick fights you gain a new power, which gives you an easier time fighting one of the other Mavericks. This rule makes it so that when you enter a stage, you know exactly what to expect from it. You can also apply this to dangers, where in Mega Man games you know that getting hit by spikes is an instant kill. Those rules are important to maintain and follow through on consistently, so players understand the situations they're in and what to expect from them. Those expectations are of course informed by the consequences of an individual player's actions, which are also enforced by the rules. If a player was merely restricted and given the correct expectations with a game, they would still be mostly free to do whatever they'd like in a game without consequences. Games make players content with the cost of making certain decisions on a moment-to-moment basis. Doing something risky in Devil May Cry may not matter much during an individual fight, but it could have disastrous consequences by the time you reach the boss of the mission you're playing. If you decide to fly over a section in Tears of the Kingdom, you know you're losing out on some of the interesting things you might be able to find on the ground, and if you're playing Mega Man X and decide not to explore, you end up being much weaker to take on the final stages of the game. Each of these consequences forces the players to consider their decisions and make smart moves to maneuver around the challenges the game will present them with. All these rules make it possible to have meaningful experiences with the game. They're a core part of the game's design. Now that we're done talking about why rules exist in other games for a bit, I think you'll see why they're useful for having a discussion on tabletop games, even if these games are not inherently competitive or meant for only one player. Having a set of rules for an RPG provides its players with a consistent set of parameters for understanding the game. Matt Colville calls this its own language, given how the rules are being used to communicate certain ideas to each of the players. You can also see that the restrictions some rules place on players are to appropriately set expectations and deliver consequences. If you fail to trip an enemy, this happens. If you succeed at defeating a monster, this happens. If you tend to an ally's wound and roll above this number, this happens. Having these sorts of rules are important for the players and the game master to set clear expectations with one another and ensure the game is working how both of them understood it would. Without rules there, those situations would be up for debate on how to resolve them. That said, TTRPGs are in the unique circumstance to provide the game master the option to improvise their rules to ensure their players are having a good time. Another area TTRPGs are unique in is that their rules can also build out the world that the players are meant to inhabit. Pathfinder 2nd Edition's rarity rules tell you a bit of information about Galarian, the default Pathfinder setting. They also serve the mechanical purpose of informing the GM of how disruptive a certain game mechanic might be to the tone of the game. Rules like these provide clear expectations for how the players should be understanding the world they are playing in, and help them understand what is and isn't tolerated by their GM. It also provides them with actionable information to choose from. The rules provide expectations for how a human or an elf works, which is important when you're making the decision of who you want to be in these games and express any sort of narrative agency with the game. This is a very important aspect to the rules in an RPG for me. I want a game to have my players understand the way certain rules work and ways they can work around them or work with them to create outcomes the GM wasn't expecting. It's a form of expression you don't get from lighter systems. Even if your GM disapproves of a certain action, the players are given agency by the rule set to move forward with it anyway. They don't need permission from the GM to decide that's something their character should be able to do. I feel that all these aspects help players and game masters communicate with one another over the imaginary world everyone is playing in. That said, there's a strong contingent of designers on the internet who feel that rules actually slow the game down.
Discari, Lord of Locusts, leave my city!
Let the feast begin.
A big part of the design ethos of the old school Renaissance or OSR community is their belief that rules omit bits of the fiction that you would normally sort out through conversation. There's an article about it and everything. The ethos is referred to as rules elide, which simply means that rules omit tasks you'd rather not have a back and forth with your GM about. The example used in the article is the idea of picking a lock. If a player wants to pick a lock, the GM and the player would have to narrate over exactly how they do such a task, when with a rule it's boiled down to a simple check. This sheds some light on the quote we went over earlier with Mothership's designer. McCoy is saying that a mechanic not existing forces a conversation to happen in the fiction that he was intending to be tense and interesting. He didn't want all that intensity and intrigue to be boiled down to a die roll. Now, we'll get into some of the issues I have with this ethos in a moment, but I think it's important to pay the devil its due. Rules do elide certain tasks I would rather not roleplay. For example, the trip maneuver in Pathfinder 2nd Edition has clear guidelines on what a player needs in order to trip, and it doesn't involve them explaining how they can use their martial arts skills to sweep a leg and push at the same time. This is what's happening in the fiction of the game, however the GM is not required to narrate that as it's been abstracted through die roll. Coming back to the lockpicking example, it's important to note that lockpicking is a common fantasy, but it's also something your average person wouldn't necessarily know about. This means it's probably a good thing for that dialogue not to happen between the player and the game master, given it will likely be uninformed and not very fun. Having these abstractions help us get closer to the fantasy without worrying about literally studying all the time to become our characters. Instead, it's more about fulfilling that fantasy with some interesting things that might happen on a failure. This is another important part of Rules Elide that I can also agree with. What a game doesn't have rules for can tell you almost as much as what a game does have rules for. Pathfinder and D&D don't have a section where you learn how to file taxes for a small business growing in Texas. We don't have rules for that because the game is not trying to provide that kind of experience. It's important to keep these positive aspects of the design ethos in your mind as we continue to discuss some of the aspects of it that I don't like as much. The best thing to mention here is that rules don't only elide. I'm not sure if this is any OSR fan's actual position, but the rules surrounding combat in games like PF2, Lancer, and D&D don't exist to omit combat from the game, but to provide exciting experiences that are interesting on a tactical level and from a resource management level. To say these rules omit anything is pretty silly. They are in-depth and want players to think about their actions and how they're going about them. The rules in this instance are working to provide an experience that you wouldn't be able to get by simply narrating through that particular instance. When looking at something like Pathfinder 2nd Edition's tactical combat, you can see how the rules restrict the player's actions, which makes the player think about how they want to best utilize their actions and abilities. This is a very unique and interesting bit of design that we could not have if we were to narrate a battlefield. You can see this in narrative-focused games as well. In Kane, Tom Bloom is using the system of sin overflow to represent that becoming the sins you fight against isn't a matter of choice all the time, it's a matter of circumstance. As you continue to push your limits as a psychic, you eventually lose control and become the thing you needed to defeat. This enhances the game's built-in story of empathy, learning that this process isn't always intentional, but sometimes a necessity of circumstance makes you think about the sins you do fight against. This is a set of narrative beats which are enhanced by a rule system where you track how badly you've been doing at managing your resources. This is something you could decide to narrate between you and your players, and it might be enhanced in a few ways as a result of doing it that way. However, you would lose the visceral way that gaining more sin leads to interesting decision-making and enhancing the narrative that Bloom is trying to build. In both cases, tactical combat-heavy games and narrative games like Kane, rules are providing and enhancing a specific experience the author is trying to build out with the game. As such, we cannot say that rules simply elide. They do much more than that. Again, I'm not sure if this is the opinion of large parts of the OSR community. They may understand these principles as well, but when looking at their posts about the concept, they seem incapable of acknowledging the strength that rules do play and providing the experience that the designers want to provide. It's important to view these things as a whole and not flatly declare that rules do one specific thing, or that removing them is always better for the game you're trying to design. Now that we've had some discussion on why rules exist and if they solely elide, let's look at why you might design a rules-light game or a rules-heavy game. With a rules-light game, you're often requiring your players to participate in the fiction and building the experience as much as the game master does. This usually comes down to making decisions for your character in the fiction, which would not typically be provided by the rules, but which do seem reasonable. This allows players a certain degree of freedom with the rules elements that are being provided, and it puts much of the game into their hands. In a rules-heavy game, you're often trying to build a set of rules for your players to understand and master. Players are often not required to get their GM's permission to do certain activities in rules-heavy games. Instead, they often have what are derisively called paper buttons. When they commit to some action, they understand the mechanical implications of the action, and there's little confusion as to what occurs on a success and what occurs on a failure. Players don't have to worry about if an idea is reasonable to their GM, but they can instead decide their next actions based on what the game has already established is available to them. While I'm much more in favor of the rules-heavy approach where players and GMs have clear expectations about how certain actions are meant to be adjudicated by the system, I can see why someone would enjoy a more rules-light approach where players are encouraged more to participate. In rules-heavy games, you can often have players who feel disengaged from the fiction of the world because they're so blinded by the mechanics of the game. This leads to players believing that because a specific option exists, it means they can always take it. While this has some nasty implications for play culture, it also subverts the whole point of a GM who is meant to be a judge and a representation of the world. That said, I can definitely see a more mechanically focused player simply rubbing up against a rules-light system in similar ways. Jumping back to Mothership for a moment, I can totally imagine a scenario where a player feels they don't want to take stealth as an option, given they have more mechanically reliable options on their character sheet. Sure, those players would be better suited by unlearning some of those behaviors. However, some players are going to really struggle with those kinds of changes. Some players simply think more mechanically than others. You have to understand when making your game that they will not inherently appeal to those players as a result of that. It's just not their style. Speaking of styles of play, another thing you need to think about when working on TTRPGs is the style of play your game encourages. We've discussed this just a bit ago, but the rules-light games often have the GM work as the arbiter of all decision making. The rules lack any sort of robust structure, so the GM is thought to be the one creating those rules or making things up on the fly. As a result, players are encouraged to be cunning and make their GM accept reasonable actions without rolling any dice, or interacting with any kind of mechanic. This builds a playstyle which is almost laser focused on avoiding using the actual mechanics as much as possible. While this may be fun for some people, I prefer it when a game helps me build stakes in a story, rather than giving my players carte blanche to commit to any action which I deem reasonable. It also, in my mind, leads to more disagreements on the table over what is considered a reasonable action and what is considered an unreasonable one. Players want to advocate for their course of action, and GMs have to adjudicate if this action is reasonable in this instance, or if it might be unreasonable later, etc. This puts a lot on the GM's shoulders on the spot, which can be equally frustrating as pushing against a stringent rules system. Rules-heavy games are rightly criticized for restraining the ways players can interact with the fiction, or bogging aspects like combat down with conditions and math that most players find unexciting. Even if we can acknowledge the importance of conditions in a tactical combat game, it's not always the most fun or interesting way to interact with the game. That said, I think by the nature of their rules-heavy approach, these games tend to give the players a lot more agency through the mechanics of the game compared to the rules-light games. You're relying significantly less on the GM's interpretation of your actions. To bring back the language analogy from earlier, you and your players have such a sophisticated language that even though you can't completely convey your subjective experiences to one another, you can convey enough information that the two of you can act accordingly. If a player mentions they're going to cast Howling Blizzard in PF2E, the spell works the same way every single time regardless of the way your GM might want it to work. These sorts of mechanics give players a bit more of a narrative backbone compared to some other rules-like games. Sure, the player now has to understand a bit more of the language and how it works, but they're also given more options to communicate exactly what they want to do, and the GM doesn't have to do as much interpretation. The GM is always going to have to interpret player actions and make decisions about how they want those actions to play out. However, you can clearly see how a rules-light game like Mouse Ritter focuses on making the game more reliant on the GM than something like Lancer or Pathfinder. This relates back to why competitive games have rules, to provide as consistent an experience as possible from game to game. While TTRPGs are not competitive games, these rules-heavy games do build more consistent experiences, while rules-light games tend to be more table-dependent. This is a feature of OSR design, not a bug. I think it would thrill a lot of OSR designers to hear that I don't think two groups would play their game the same way. That's often exactly the kind of experience they want to foster at the table, something unique that you can't get anywhere else. When we look at Pathfinder and D&D though, they have lots of rules to provide players with a consistent rule set even across multiple GMs. This is important for things like Paizo Society Play or Wizards Adventurers League, but it's also important for community conversation around the games. If people want to discuss how strong a particular spell is in a rules-light game, they would first have to contend with how some people don't even interact with spells in the game, or interpret it a different way to work with them. In rules-heavy spaces, discussing something like if Fireball is too strong in D&D isn't really all that crazy, considering the designers outright say as much in the 2014 DMG. Discussions of rules changes and adjustments in future editions is a big thing in rules-heavy spaces. But honestly, if no one releases a second edition of Mouse Ritter, I doubt anyone would really end up caring that much, because if you wanted more content for Mouse Ritter, the rules are so light, you could end up writing your own supplement with some basic options in there, and it would substantially change change how the game would work. With a rules-heavy game, you tend to have more of a guarantee that the actions you take in the game are going to have a solid foundation for play. You'll know exactly how an ability works and how it affects the player or the target. You'll understand exactly how this condition works with no room for interpretation, which is great for players who are trying to inflict that condition on their enemies because they know exactly how it'll affect them. Having guarantees like that can be equally freeing as a system which provides few actual rules, which are meant to be interpreted loosely by the players and the GM.
Nothing that exists is perfect. It is a sad truth, but you can learn from it and begin the journey on a new path.
When we're building, reviewing, and thinking about games, it's important to view the context of how a specific game is trying to build its systems, rather than conveying this false notion that some mechanics are simply better than other ones. Almost always, you're simply trading some experiences for other experiences. Acknowledging how rules-light and rules-heavy games provide those different experiences is important for all TTRPGs to grow, and we get more people to try out more games. Having many rules still provides benefits you do lose out on when you get rid of them. They don't always elide. They can provide experiences or build tension in the game that do exist. They can also work to build the world of the game in an interesting way that we may not have stumbled upon through freeform roleplay. You might also just need rules to provide a specific experience, which means they're actually enhancing the experience the players are having. Of course, you need to be cognizant of the experience you're going for when building these rules. You should be sorting these sorts of ideas out at the start of your design, since building a game where you want the GM to make a lot of decisions on how it's ran is a very different kind of rules writing experience compared to a game where you want people to be able to talk about it with consistency across multiple spaces. This is important because while some rules you build will be to elide aspects of fictions you would rather not roleplay, other rules are going to be working to build the kind of experience at the table you want to see. Finally, I want to once again express my disdain for saying that one style is inherently better or more interesting than the other. Lots of complicated rule systems have interesting aspects to them which are worth diving into, and there are some design ideas in simple games which work so well they're worth stealing from more complicated games. To come back to Sean's quote and this image that expressed it as a fruitful void, I think it's wrong to say that games not having those mechanics inherently leads to more tense experiences or even better experiences. They work perfectly well for the kinds of games McCoy wants to build, but to prop them up as inherently better seems like a much stronger claim. We should avoid thinking that rules-light games are inherently better in any way to rules-heavy games. You're always trading some parts of the experience to emphasize other aspects. Thinking this way, I believe, leads to being more thoughtful with the rules we build and helps designers decide what they would like to put in their games.